Creepy Stories Volume Number 2. When I was 3 or 4, we lived in a 1950s ranch house my parents bought at a sheriff's sale. It was kind of run down, but a bargain because it was only few blocks from my grandmother's home, on the same block as my sister's school, and my dad could be to work in 5 minutes. Where the side door came into the house from the carport, there was a utility closet. It housed the hot water heater, a furnace, and a trapdoor down to the crawlspace below the house. The utility closet was in a short L-shaped hallway between the kitchen and the den, which we used as a family room. I remember the crawlspace always had a dirty water smell to it. The floor of the crawlspace wasn't poured concrete, but was composed of loose gravel. My sister would be at kindergarten all day, so it was just me and my mom until it was time to walk to the school to get her. I would play alone in the den while my mom was decorating cakes, her side job, in the kitchen. My mom would hear me carrying on long conversations in the den with my toys. One of my favorite things was to make a cave by lifting the leg rest of the recliner and playing with my toys underneath. It used to annoy my mother because I never put it back down. One day, she asked me why I always did that, and I told her, because the light from the big window hurts their eyes. The light hurts your toys' eyes? No. The 2 little black boys who come out to play with me. That freaked her out, so she talked to my dad about it and they asked me more about it. I told them I had 2 friends named Poomy and Punky. They were 2 little black boys that lived under the heater in the utility closet. Poomy always wanted to play, but he had to drag Punky along with him because he never wanted to come, but they weren't allowed to ever be apart. They were both terrified of my dad, and they would disappear back into the closet when they would hear him coming. At night, since my dad was home, they were too afraid to come out. So they would fall down into the crawlspace and crawl until they were under my bedroom. Sometimes they would whisper jokes to me through the floorboards, but mostly I would just hear them moving around in the gravel. It ended when my mom found me sitting in the utility closet with the door shut. I told her that Poomy and Punky had to leave because a raggedy man who walked along the train tracks at night almost found them. They saw him in our backyard trying to peek through the screen door. So, they crawled into the furnace and turned to cinders and flew out through the chimney. I have a younger brother who had an imaginary friend when he was younger. He was also an avid sleepwalker. When he was around 3 or 4, he started talking to someone he called Freya. He described Freya as a dark-skinned man with little clothes who loved to hunt in the wilderness. Then one day he told me that Freya used to live nearby the house a long time ago. And then some white people came and burned him alive and killed his village. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. I remember I would be in my room and hear him talking like he was having a conversation, and when I would try to check on him, he would immediately become silent and turn his head as soon as I peeked around the corner. Very unsettling. My other brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad for the summer, but the day before he got back, my youngest brother told my mother and I that Freya does not like when brother is mean to me. He's going to scare him. The night he got home, my mom and I were downstairs and heard a scream that I can still hear to this day. We ran upstairs and found the middle brother swearing that someone was shaking his bed violently. It was a bunk bed. My youngest brother was sound asleep. A month later, my youngest brother took a bad fall and cracked his skull. He was fine, but never talked to Freya again after that. He would also sleepwalk constantly. And show up right next to my bed and stare at me until I woke up and promptly shit myself. One night I heard my front door open and close. Since it was 4 a.m., I went to check it out. I opened the door and found my brother at the far end of the yard, in the snow, only in his underwear, staring right at me. Then he slowly waved. Those shivers weren't from the cold. When I was 9, my parents split up, and my dad rented a house in a pretty isolated part of town. Surrounded by woods, couldn't see any neighbors. It was in a nice area, especially for kids. An old friend of his lived in the basement apartment. He was kind of a weird guy. Super neckbeard, into mystic shit, and hit on my mom constantly when she and my dad were still together. Upstairs, my dad lived with Big Frank, a big teddy bear Viking guy who loved me and my little brother, 5, at the time, and Barney, a very religious stagehand who also liked my brother and me a lot. For a while, when my brother and I came to visit Dad, everything was cool. We'd run around in the woods and play games and stay up late and eat junk food. Slowly, I started to feel more and more creeped out whenever we were there. I'd run to my bed after turning the lights out, because every child knows the bed is the only place you're safe. I constantly felt like something was there. One day, my brother told me his closet door opened in the middle of the night. We didn't tell Dad, probably because he wasn't very good at listening to us back then, and we knew he wouldn't take us seriously. Instead, we told Barney. Barney said he'd felt something evil in the house, and he'd do something about it. When everyone else left the house, Barney sprinkled some holy water around, lit some candles, and said a few prayers. The house felt much less scary when we got back that evening, but it went right back to being creepy and awful by the next weekend. Until Dad moved out 5 years later, we just put up with it and pretended not to be scared. It's easy enough to put up with something creepy for a couple days at a time, as long as nothing actually happens. A couple summers ago, I moved in with Dad and stepmom. He got married a year after moving out of the house, while going to school. One beautiful evening, we were sitting around playing a game and having a few beers, when my stepmom brought up that house and how filthy it was because a bunch of bachelors lived there. We all laughed and talked about the old roommates and wacky things that happened while they all lived there. Then, I said, bro and I were sure that place was haunted or something. He says his closet door opened in the middle of the night. I never saw anything weird, but God, that place was creepy. My dad nodded and said, yeah. There was some kind of evil presence there. I never told you kids this, but I was pushed down the stairs a few times while going to the basement for laundry. And there was this one time I went to the kitchen, and all our knives were stuck in the ceiling. Many years ago, when I met my ex, she and her family lived in a mobile home. My ex has this younger sister, who is a bit messed up, in and out of psych wards, etc. My ex and her younger sister shared a room in the mobile home. While we were dating, and before my son was born, she told me this story about how her younger sister would wake up and talk to the man in the hallway. The man always had a suitcase and wore a brimmed hat. My ex and her family always dismissed them as, well, the younger sister is a bit nuts. Flash forward a few years. My ex and I have a son together. Her parents moved out of the mobile home and into a house, and were renting the mobile home to my ex. Our son's room was the exact same room my ex and her sister slept in. One night after our son had gone to bed, and was asleep for a long while, I checked on him. We heard him get out of bed. We figured he would come out of his room and ask to use the potty. Instead, he started talking to someone. He said hi and started talking about his favorite stuffed animal. At that time it was a ducky. Curious, I called back and asked who he was talking to. He pops his head out of his room and informs me he's talking to the man with a suitcase and is wearing a hat. At the time he was about 2.5, and never heard about his aunt seeing the same guy. I should start off by saying my brother is not only a military man, but he's your basic hetero, never let them see you cry, cliché of a military man. He's not afraid of anything, well, except for the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while. The girls, specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights where him and his soldier friends had the night off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little drinking and no luck with girls, the guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, he tells my brother the main reason he wanted to get home early was because his little sister had been suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had an episode. At this point in the story, I should explain how this guy's house was shaped. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe, with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of one side of the U shape and his sister's all the way at the other end. So they are essentially across the garden from each other. If he looks out of his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So anyways, they decide to call it a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window to look across the garden into his sister's window, to check on her. He lifts the blind and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look and he stops him. He tells him that he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother, naturally, does not believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window and lifts the blind, but this time, he finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a dark black puff of smoke with a face. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the guy's covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see that the smoky figure had come a little closer and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheets. I don't know what to believe, or if maybe they drank more than what they said they did that night and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story, and when he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. This occurrence didn't happen to me, but to my grandmother. It would have taken place in the 1930s. My grandmother was a young teen at the time and she lived with her mother and 5 siblings in an old house in the middle of the woods. The area was the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. My grandmother had got into a fight with her mother. She took off into the woods all day to get away from her for a while. When it got dark, she decided to come home. When she got home, the doors were locked and everyone was in bed. There was an old cot sitting outside the house and she decided to just sleep on the cot until morning. In the morning when she woke up, there was some creature sitting at the end of the cot. I remember she said it was really ugly and had a full set of sharp teeth. It was shaped like a person but didn't look like a person. She said that it just sat there and smiled at her with its abnormally large mouth of sharp teeth. When she started to get up from the cot to get away, it would start to get up and move towards her. When she would sit back down, it would sit back down. She sat there staring at it for a few seconds and it continued to sit and smile at her. The creature was sitting between her and the front door. She finally jumped up and made a run for the back door. When she got to the back door, it was locked, but her mother was in the kitchen making biscuits. She was banging on the door screaming to be let in, and her mother told her to go around to the front because her hands were covered in dough. My grandmother screamed, she couldn't, and was frantic enough that her mother ran to let her in. She told her mother what she had seen. They all went outside. She could still see the creature, but they couldn't. It laughed and laughed at her. She had my grandmother's 2 brothers take the cot out to the woods and chop it up and burn it. It laughed at her, even while they were chopping the cot. Then it just disappeared. When I was in my late teens, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a girl sitting in my room. She had her back to my bedroom door and had her arms wrapped around her knees. She seemed really sad, and was tinged slightly blue and glowing. I sat up, and she was gone. This happened a few more times throughout the week. I kept dismissing it as a dream. But somehow in that time, I suddenly knew her name was Sam and that she was upset about something having to do with water. She never actually spoke to me, so I don't know why or how I knew that, but again, it seemed like a dream and I've had recurring ones before, so I wasn't taking too much stock in it. Then one night, she suddenly looked up at me, like someone does when you call their name. And she smiled. Then she was gone, and I got the impression she wouldn't be back. Later that day, I was helping my mom wash the dishes and she got a phone call. She came back into the kitchen shaking her head and looking sad. I asked what was up and she asked if I remembered my aunt so-and-so. I have a bunch of family members, both biological and honorary, and I've not met all of them still, so I said no, I had no idea who that was. She told me that her daughter had been having issues lately and had an incident in a bathtub about 4 or 5 days prior. She was on life support, and the evening prior, the last time I saw the ghost girl, her family had made the decision to pull the plug. Against my better judgment, I asked what her name was. Sam, she said. Samantha. Never really could explain that one, but if ghosts are real, then it seemed like Sam enjoyed my company for a while and was happy to go when it was all over. Hopefully that was the case. When I was about 4 years old, we moved to a new town. This is one of those smaller towns where gossip gets around quickly, everyone knows the owners of the local businesses, and the regional schools have about 150 kids per grade, give or take. As a 4-year-old, it wasn't surprising that I made a few friends quickly. However, my best friend's name was Jeremy, and he was imaginary. I never really thought it was odd that I met Jeremy when I moved to this town, and while looking back I can see how the situation would creep people out, I didn't really notice it. Jeremy was around my age, and I never saw him at my house. I would go to school, and he would be playing on the jungle gym or sitting down inside on the carpet. When I left school for the day, he would wave goodbye and I would be on my way. Since no one ever really saw imaginary friends, I never noticed the difference that he appeared to actually be there. He wasn't invisible, but he also wasn't a person like you or me. He was just, I don't know, there. I told my parents about Jeremy and they sort of just brushed it off as whatever. My parents worked full-time and had 5 kids, and I was the second youngest. With a 1-year-old in the house, I was designated to the, "Oh, that's interesting," response every time something new happened. In retrospect, I also realized that I never told my parents Jeremy was imaginary. So, one day I went to school and afterwards Jeremy invited me to his house, that weekend. Jeremy didn't really talk, as far as I can remember. It was more like I heard his voice internally. Then again, I was 4 years old and didn't care too much. He told me where he lived and I said I would ask my mom. So I told my mom and she looked his family up and lo and behold, his last name was in the phone book on the road he had told me. My mom called his parents up and I'm assuming they just chatted over the phone about who they were and all that nonsense. I eventually got a nod from my mom and was really excited for my playdate. We drove over there on Saturday and I immediately went inside. My mom chatted with his parents and eventually left. I remember playing around upstairs and his parents making us food although he didn't touch it. His parents seemed nice enough but even my child brain could tell something was off. When my mom picked me up, I waved goodbye and we went home. On the way back, my mom asked me how my day was and I told her about all the fun we had. When she asked if I wanted to invite Jeremy over next week, I responded in the most innocent way a child can. "No, mommy, I don't want to. Jeremy is imaginary and I don't think he would want to come over." I think my mom pulled over and with a strange look in her eyes asked if I had said imaginary. I reassured her that he was, in fact, imaginary. We drove home quickly and my mom called the police. I never saw Jeremy after that, but I did learn that the parents actually had a boy named Jeremy who died when he was about my age. He had been really sick, never really asked more about it to be honest. His parents were both taken into custody and I never saw them again, but word is they were released because they didn't actually do anything wrong and they moved sometime later. I don't know, that was just what I heard when I was old enough to understand. I'm assuming they were delusional and believed their child was still alive. They never did anything to me, I didn't have any memory lapses about my time there and I never had to go into the creepy basement, or walk towards the light. I don't know how anyone rationalized Jeremy, but I think my parents were just happy I wasn't abducted by psychotic baby snatchers. Anyways, that's my paranormal experience for you.
Thanks for watching. Keep enjoying our videos. Like and subscribe.